All right, welcome back to another episode of the Always Adaptive podcast. I am your host, Randall James. I am a strength and running coach. I've been doing this for a little bit over 10 years, and this is episode 16, and I cannot believe that is already episode 16. I've been releasing an episode a week since I started right at the end of November, and it's crazy to me that this doesn't even seem like work. I really enjoy this process, and just over time, I'm building up a body of work now, and I'm really proud of where I started and where I am now. Today's episode is going to be me interjecting in an interview between Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Benjamin Bikman. Now, they're specifically talking about the ketogenic diet. They're talking about how carbohydrates are the source of a lot of the issues today, especially in America or the West. Dr. Jordan Peterson, though, let me just firstly say that this is not like a video bashing him. I think Dr. Jordan Peterson is great. I think if it weren't for him, I would not be where I am today. In a lot of ways, he's saved my life. He's helped shape the direction that my life is heading in. And I think that a lot of other men my age and my age group could say the same. He's helped millions of men. He's helped women too, but mainly men my age or a little bit younger are his main audience. And then Dr. Benjamin Bikman, I'm also a fan of him. I've been following him for a while, but I can't say that I've consumed his content en masse like I have Dr. Jordan Peterson, because the keto diet is just not my area of focus. It's something I'm interested in and I know a lot about, but I don't like mass consume content about the keto diet only. The reason why I wanted to bring up Peterson is because I think because he's used the carnivore diet to help him with a lot of his, not just physical, but mental issues, he's come into this diet and nutrition world and he doesn't bring the necessary nuance that's required to have a discussion about the topic, because he's only viewing it through the lens of like his issues. And he's not viewing it through the lens of like performance or strength training or anything like that. So I think it's useful for people that have an athletic background or a fitness background or something to kind of come in and talk about this, because it's not just what you eat, it's what you do that matters a lot. I don't want to go too deep down a rabbit hole here, but I've released a couple videos in the past few weeks about talking about the keto diet versus carbohydrates and its effects on performance, power, strength, and then also body composition. There's evidence that the keto diet does not allow you to build muscle at the same rate as a carbohydrate-rich diet. There's evidence that the keto diet makes you lose lean body mass. There's evidence that the keto diet makes you drop in power by a large margin. You won't be as strong, you won't be as powerful, you won't be as fast. And so these are all necessary metrics to keep into account, because to me, health means a whole lot more than just, are you fat or do you have high blood glucose? To me, health is, how strong are you? How fast are you? These things are vitally important to me. So I just wanted to bring a bit of nuance to this discussion. But you may say, well, Randall, you're no doctor. And yes, you're absolutely correct. I am not a doctor, but I do have two eyes that can read. I do have a smart brain that can comprehend studies, and I do love to read studies. You know, appeals to authority to me mean nothing. I think if the past 4 to 5 years have taught us anything about doctors, then I think it's pretty apparent that doctors can also make dumb decisions. I'm not saying that these two are in that boat. I'm just saying that appeals to authority are really meaningless when you see how divided doctors are even on medical treatments, how divided doctors are on nutrition treatments and protocols. So yeah, I think what's most important is experience and practical experience. Like, for example, you could have all the book smarts in the world, all the knowledge in the world, but until you actually apply your knowledge, it means nothing. Like my first year as a personal trainer, I was absolute garbage. I had all this book smart. I was absolutely obsessed with fitness and stuff. But first time I started working with someone, I was a terrible trainer. I had no idea to apply all that knowledge. And so I think when people first come into the health and fitness world, they have a lot of knowledge, but they're not accounting for all the different compartments of it, you could say. But in Jordan Peterson's case, like, I'm not even sure that he lifts weights. I mean, he really does talk about the importance of exercise, but I couldn't find anything of him talking about any sort of exercise protocol that he's doing or any weight training that he's doing. He actually looks very, no offense to him. I love Dr. Peterson, but he actually looks very frail, very thin. And so again, I don't think he's thinking about some of the other boxes that health gets divided into. So in this video, the two of them are going to talk about excessive carbohydrate intake is the devil and fat is amazing and It's going to sound just like every other keto is great video that you've watched or book that you've read. And I'm not here to debunk what they're saying so much as I just want to add a little bit of nuance, because what they're saying is accurate, but they're not accounting for other things. You'll see what I mean. But let's roll into the first clip and I'll get into my stance on all of this.
Type 2 diabetes being particularly well known, let's say, as a secondary consequence, but cancer, heart disease, erectile dysfunction, reproductive dysfunction, more generally, high blood pressure, you name it, immunological disease, depression, anxiety. There's almost no serious medical condition that's widespread that can't be traced to excessive carbohydrate intake. And so obviously, it seems to me, that's where the focus should be.
So that's a perfect example of a statement that needs nuance. So he just says excessive carbohydrate intake. Now, I will agree that excessive carbohydrate intake is a problem, but it's not the only problem. And it's not the only thing that disease can be linked to. So firstly, one thing we need to talk about here is that the studies that are used to draw correlation between dietary macronutrient breakdown, which would be your fats, your proteins, and your carbs, and disease are usually based off of the NHANES data, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is a really prominent source of information for a lot of these studies. And the problem with these studies is that they rely on self-reporting surveys, oftentimes on a 1 to 2 day recall, where they have to go back and just try to remember what they ate. And people are really bad at this. For example, this study, accuracy of energy intake data estimated by multi-pass 24-hour dietary recall technique, Journal of the American Dietetic Association. This shows that people underestimate how much food they eat by a modest 11% for men and 13% for women. But if you think about that, if you put that into the context of 2,500 calorie diet, 13% is 325 calories, meaning they underestimated how much they ate by 325 calories. That's an entire snack. Now, 325 calories might not seem like that much to you, but I assure you it is, especially over the course of a week or a month. That adds up. By the way, there are other studies that show even greater percentages. And there are also other studies that show that people overestimate how much movement they're getting or how much they're working out, their energy expenditure by pretty large margins. So you combine all of that, you end up with a situation where people are trying to compare different diets and the numbers just aren't accurate. You have to, unfortunately, the only way to really draw a strong correlation between a diet protocol and a specific disease is randomized controlled trials where you're controlling for protein and you're controlling for calories. Because being overweight or obese is like the number one contributor to all other chronic conditions. So if you're not controlling for weight and calories in the first place, then that's just a massive confounding factor, and that's a big problem. And the reason for that is highly palatable foods. So we've had a huge uprise in processed foods, as you know, and these foods, they're not just excessively filled with carbohydrates, they're also excessively filled with fat. And fat has more calories per gram than carbohydrates. More on that in a moment, though. Let's move on to the next clip.
So blood fat levels are going up. Now, that's not normally a problem necessarily, but that should only happen when insulin is low. Now we have this weird state where insulin is high, which should be telling the fat breakdown to slow down. I'm getting into deep biochemistry actually really quickly. No. So normally if insulin is up because we've eaten some carbs and stuff, then fat in the blood would be down because insulin would be telling the fats to hold on to it. But now, or when we're fasting or low carbohydrate diet, then insulin is down and now we're mobilizing more fat. So normally the biochemistry and the endocrinology is such that if insulin's high, fats are down. If insulin's low, fats are up. Unless the fat cells are overfilled or have undergone hypertrophy or a growth expansion, now you have high insulin and high fats. And so the body can't burn that fat. It has to store it. And so now we start storing fat in tissues that are ill-suited, like the pancreas is getting fat.
Why isn't it just...
Right. So he is correct. Insulin goes up, fat goes down normally. And when you have excessive carbohydrates, that makes the fat cells grow. Now, what I want to bring back is the combination of carbs and fat, because it's not just excessive carbohydrate intake that does that. And oh, by the way, add in movement to account for the excessive carbohydrate, and that doesn't happen. But let me give you an example really quick of the combination of carbs and fat. If I bring up a Little Debbie glazed donut stick, your initial reaction is probably that, oh, there's a lot of sugar in that, carbohydrates, right? And I wouldn't blame you for that. I asked a couple people this already, and immediately everyone goes to sugar, right? It's filled with sugar. But let's break this down a little bit. There are 9 calories per gram of fat, and there are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. Now, in this snack, there are 14 grams of fat and 25 grams of sugar. So far, so good, right? Right? There's more grams of carbs than there are fat. Makes sense. But if we do the equation on that, there's actually 126 calories from fat and only 100 calories from carbs. So there's more fat calories than there are carbohydrate calories. 57.3% of the calories are from fat, 45.5% of the calories are from carbohydrates. So this is the perfect example of when you have both. So going back to his example where insulin rises and fat normally lowers, and if you have excessive carbohydrate intake, both of them rise and you run into a problem where your body starts to store fat. Well, same thing happens when you have fat and carbohydrates together. You have your insulin rise, and because you're intaking fat, you also see a rise in fat. And the thing about fat is that fat does not have to go through any sort of conversion process. It's more readily stored on the body than carbohydrate is. So carbs have to be converted to glucose first. And then in the presence of being sedentary, then yes, those carbs get stored as fat. But if you were to eat some carbs, the carbs get converted to glucose, and then you work out shortly after that, those carbs go to replenishing your muscle glycogen stores. So it's not always that situation leads to the carbs being stored as fat, but the dietary fat doesn't need to do that. Now, you can also use fat as a fuel source, but that's also very much context dependent. I think the point here, though, is that what he's saying needs nuance, and that's what I'm here to bring. I think most people watch it. If they watch the video, the interview, they would walk away saying carbs are evil, as most keto videos do. You watch it and you're like, well, I guess I should not be eating any carbohydrates whatsoever because carbs are the devil and they're the originator of all disease, and everyone's going to perish because they're eating carbohydrates. And it's just not the case. If you can be smart about your carbohydrate intake, don't combine carbohydrates with fat. A small degree of that is okay. But if everything you're eating is 50% carbs, 50% fat, that's going to be a problem in terms of body composition and in terms of disease. But also taking into account your energy expenditure, not being sedentary, taking more walks, lifting weights, running, all this stuff is vitally important to making sure that your body stays healthy and your body composition maintains balance.
We have access to an endless array of carbohydrates, and they're very easily converted into sugar. Well,
Yes.
so we have access to sugar of various forms and to carbohydrates in absolute plenitude.
Yes.
Right. And so that's easily converted. That's very high energy source, very dense energy source, and it's easily converted to fat. And so that's what happens. And the reason that happens is because we're evolved for lean times and we store excess energy like a grizzly bear or a camel. And we do that so we don't starve to death in the winter.
So right there, once again, talking about carbs are stored as fat. Now, I'm going to reiterate my point that fat is already in the storage form. And so fat gets stored as fat. But the other thing that he said there is that carbs are very energy dense. Well, hold on a second. Fat is actually way more energy dense. It's twice as energy dense, you could say. But you also have to think about there are so many different theories on insulin resistance. If you ever talk to someone and they seem really matter of fact about this is how insulin resistance happens and it's the only way and this is the only thing, like steer clear of that person, because that's one of my biggest pet peeves, by the way, is like just people that talk really matter-of-factly. And, you know, one thing that I love that Dr. Lane Norton said is you can always tell, the signs of a true expert, you'll see the more they know, they start to use phrases like, I don't know, or I'm not sure, or it depends. And that's exactly the nuance that's required in conversations like this, because again, you don't want people walking away thinking that carbohydrates are just totally evil and you can never have any carbohydrates at all. So back to fat being stored as fat, one of the theories of insulin resistance is the fat storage example, where you end up with a situation because fat is very energy dense. if you combine carbohydrates and fat, you end up with a caloric surplus, an acute caloric surplus, where the fat gets stored as fat. And because most of your insulin cells are in your muscles, you end up with this like marbling of your fat, and it blocks those receptors, which is a problem. The insulin can't get where it's going, then you end up with elevated insulin. So it's not so much that the cells are resisting the insulin, it's that they really just can't get to where they're going. So that's just something to consider on the fat front, that fat isn't always good. It's not that fat is innocent. And of course, it depends on what kind of fat you're intaking as well.
You see this, I guess some of the proof of that is that islanders who tend to be evolved to get through lean times, they're very, very efficient in their metabolism. If they go on a North American high carb diet, they just balloon.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So islanders get put on a North American high carb diet, they just balloon. Is that true? It's hard for me to know exactly which population he's referring to, but my sense is that he's talking about the Pacific Islands. And there is a World Health Report that came out that was looking at body composition of Pacific Islanders when they were on their native diet versus when they started to consume more saturated fats from processed foods and kind of a Western, similar to a Western diet. And what they found is that, yes, they had a lot of carbohydrates, but they also had a lot of fat. 49% of their calories were coming from carbohydrate and 42% of their calories were coming from fat. So again, that's just the nuance that needs to be inserted here, where in Jordan's mind, he's just thinking of the carbohydrates and that it's only the carbohydrates. And if you eliminate the carbohydrates, they'll be fine. Well, you could say the same thing. If you eliminate the fat or reduce the fat to healthy levels and you maintain these people outside of a caloric, get them out of caloric surplus, these people can be totally fine. And you see examples of this with people that are healthy that know how to manipulate their dietary macronutrients, where if they're high carb, they keep their fat low. And it's very similar to if you're high fat, you keep your carbs low. There's a give and a take there. You have to pull on one lever. You can't pull on both levers and just open the floodgates. And I think that's inherently the problem, is that controlling your carbohydrate intake is a little bit more difficult. It takes a bit more nuance because you're trying to manipulate several different food groups. Whereas with the keto or the carnivore diet, it's real simple. Cut out carbs and just stick to it. Yes, it requires a bit of discipline. It is hard to just do the keto or carnivore diet. Not so much the carnivore diet, just people rave about it, just eat a bunch of ribeyes and stuff. But it's much harder to eat meat, fat, and carbohydrates and fiber because you have to account for your fiber intake. So I get it, but it's possible, as I'm evidence of that. You know, I'm not overweight. I eat probably more carbs than most, probably 80% of people. I eat more carbs.
Okay, so let's focus on insulin to begin with. Tell people what insulin does and then what insulin resistance does.
Yeah, brilliant. Insulin is an absolutely essential hormone in the body. As much as I am going to go on in the next few minutes and paint the picture of it being a villain, it's critical. If you don't have it, you have a disease called type 1 diabetes and you will die. Type 1 diabetes used to be a death sentence. In the absence of insulin, the body will not last long. And so it is here for a purpose. We need it. However, we need it to work in our favor. And to do that, we need it to be generally keeping in a normal range. And so you just a moment ago framed the question by pointing a finger at carbohydrates. I agree with that completely.
Carbohydrates and fat. Now, you often hear that insulin is the fat storage hormone. And that's another thing that really drives me up a wall, is because they'll only say that. And while it's true, beyond glucose control, insulin does so much. It supports muscle growth. It prevents muscle breakdown. I mean, this is why you see bodybuilders literally injecting insulin. So if it was as simple as insulin just makes you store fat, how are these bodybuilders that are super lean, super jacked, ripped, why aren't they fat? You would think that they would be overweight. Their body fat percentage would be crazy. But we're talking about some of the leanest individuals that exist ever on the entire planet. So you have to think about if there is a proposed hypothesis and right out of the gate, there are people that fly in the face of that, that hypothesis is wrong. If your hypothesis is that insulin makes you store fat and that's it, yet there's this population of people that are leaner than everyone else that literally inject the substance that you're talking about, then that hypothesis is false. Now, insulin does make you store fat, but again, we have to take into account activity level. What type of exercise are you doing? What intensity of exercise are you doing? These things are all vitally important to this whole equation. So that's why I continue to harp on these videos and compare these studies and talk about this topic, because I'm just trying to get people to look at the big picture here and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
That has happened so often when you take things to that level. So if we put the blame where it belongs, not only are carbohydrates the only macronutrient that people have an addiction for, no one's addicted to fat, no one's addicted to protein. If only people were sitting around on a Friday night listening to us chat and thinking, oh, I really want a stick of butter. No, no one. They want something sweet and gooey. They want something salty and crunchy. So we crave carbs.
So hold on a second there. He just used the word gooey. Now, if I say a food is gooey, what does it remind you of? Does it remind you of carbohydrates, or does it remind you of fat? If you're anything like me, then it reminds you of fat. Like, let's take into account a cream-filled Twinkie. The Twinkie has sugar in it. Of course, the bread on the Twinkie is carbohydrate, and there's some sugar in the Twinkie, in the cream, but the cream is fat. That's where the majority of the fat is, actually. And so he right there admits that it is the combination without even realizing it. Now, he says people are addicted to carbs and not addicted to fat. I would disagree with that. I will say that people will crave like fruit snacks and gummy candies, things like that, Skittles, Gushers. That stuff can all be addicting, sure. But let's talk about regular carbohydrate, because again, he didn't say candy. He just said carbs are addicting. If you have a plain white potato, does that sound appealing to you? Are you addicted to plain white potato? No. And in fact, plain white potato is very high in the satiety index, meaning like the index that tells you how filling or how satisfied a food is. White potato is very high on that index. Now, when does white potato become more appealing to you? When you put cheese and butter and salt on it, right? Even just the cheese and the butter part makes it way more appealing. That, to me, it's not the carbohydrates that are making you addicted. It's the textures. A lot of these food companies, going back to the donut, for example, that is by design. These food companies do a lot of research into texture and look, mouthfeel, and the taste of it. And it's not just the carbs, the sugar, it's the fat too. It's like such a rewarding experience for your dopamine centers of your brain. Again, I know I'm nitty picking on this, but it is a big deal that he's only saying that carbohydrates are addicting and not fat. It's the combination. I wouldn't say like no one's going to start eating he's right. No one's going to eat a stick of butter. No one's going to get addicted to a stick of butter. Just like no one's going to get addicted to plain white rice. I eat white rice all the time. If I just ate it plain, that would be terrible. Of course, I add salt to it. I add a little bit of crunch to it. There's ground beef in it, so I eat it. If I was just eating white rice on its own, that would be a no-fly zone for me. So each of them, the fat on its own isn't addicting. The carbs on its own isn't addicting, with the exception of things like fruit snacks. But even candy bars, it's not just sugar. There's fat in a lot of these chocolate bars, Snickers, Milky Ways, all those things. So again, combination of carbs and fats.
But you also alluded to an insulin resistance, I believe, that's merely a consequence of insulin that spikes too high.
That's right.
So there's multiple reasons for insulin resistance in a heavy carb-loaded diet.
Oh, yes. All of them become relevant there. Yes, so we've now kind of gone to both here. The slow insulin resistance is the slow and steady growth of the fat cell, which we outlined earlier. And that's a consequence of insulin being up, telling the fat cell to grow. And then the fat cell saying, okay, insulin, what do you want me to grow with? It's the calories. So you have to have both for a fat cell to grow, an insulin stimulus and sufficient calories to fuel the growth. Then we have the fast insulin resistance. I mentioned inflammation. That is one. And then the other one, that is the main one, I argue, is too much insulin itself. And then once the body becomes insulin resistant, now you really can start going down that list of chronic diseases that are the top 10 killers.
So right off the bat there, I just want to hone in on the fact that he is admitting that you need both high insulin and adequate calories to fuel the growth of the fat cells. So I agree with him about insulin resistance and its terrible effects. No argument from me there. I'm only arguing the root cause of it. It's not just sugar. It's not just carbs. It's the combination of the two. Because what is one of the easiest ways that you get a caloric surplus? Eating carbs and fat together. Because as I already showed you, 1 gram of fat is 9 calories, whereas 1 gram of carbohydrate is only 4 calories. So it's very easy to add more fat to your already carbohydrate-rich diet especially because if you think about fat, again, it's like going back to the cheese and the butter example, that doesn't take up very much space in your stomach or in your mouth or on the plate itself. The sauces, they're very minuscule, right? But it's because it's so energy dense, it's a huge increase in the calories. That's why if you eat a salad and you put a vinaigrette on it versus putting ranch on it, you put ranch on it, boom, that calorie has 300 more calories than it should have. That salad has 300 more calories than it should have. Now, he's talking about two different types of insulin resistance. They're slow and fast. And hey, he might be right about fast insulin, but my argument is that it's slow insulin resistance that is more prevalent. I think people are just eating too much and their activity levels are through the floor. People are sedentary. They're not moving. They're sitting at their desk for 8 to 10 hours at a time, setting no movement alarms whatsoever. They might take a 10-minute walk during lunch to go get something that's high in carbs and fat at some sub shop that has, the sub has cheese and sauce and bacon and all this stuff on it and minuscule protein. And then it's combined with the bread. So I think the slow insulin resistance is the problem because people are just eating too much and not moving enough.
They're going up. In fact, one of the things I love disabusing my students of is the false idea that glucose is the preferred fuel for the brain.
Yeah, right.
Every sort of knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing professor will just spout that off without actually knowing a thing about brain metabolism.
Yeah.
The reality is, if someone has glucose levels at 5 to 6 millimolar in a normal range, and they're fasted or on a ketogenic diet, even when their ketones get to 1 or 2 millimolar, so over here, the brain has already shifted so that up to 60+% of its energy is coming from the ketone.
So
don't
when it
tell
has
me,
a choice, it'll pick ketones.
Indeed.
As ketones rise, glucose utilization drops. Does such a study exist? I had a hard time finding it, but one thing I want to point out is I've never heard people say that it's the preferred fuel source for the brain. I've heard that it's the preferred fuel source for the body. And I think that obviously that's context dependent. Like if you're sedentary, if you're at rest or your heart rate's really low, your body has no need to burn glucose for fuel. But if you're training, if you're lifting weights, if you're running fast, if you're doing a row machine workout or any number of different things, yes, I would argue that glucose is the preferred fuel source there, as evidenced by the studies that I've talked about in several other videos, where you look at performance when you compare ketogenic diet versus a carbohydrate-rich diet. And especially with power drops off of a cliff, where the one specific study I'm referring to saw an actual decrease in power by, I think it was close to 15 points, where the Western diet group saw an increase in power over a 10-week period. And I believe that was closer to 100 points. So a 100-point increase versus a 15-point decrease. I'm probably getting that wrong just by a couple points, but you can go back and fact check me. That's fine. The point still stands, though, that you will see a performance decrease in the ketogenic group for most of these studies, or at least just not as much of an increase over the course of the study as compared to the carbohydrate-rich diets. So that's vitally important to take into account. Again, this is why these people, they aren't thinking about exercise and performance and strength and power and speed and all this stuff, which if you bring those into the picture and those are a part of your lens through which you're viewing someone as healthy, then this whole conversation gets flipped on its head.
At the end of this conversation, one of my great hopes is that someone listening opens up their morning medicine cabinet and they take out their 2 medications for their diabetes. They take out their medication for their blood pressure. They take out their medication for their PCOS or their erectile dysfunction, thinking because there's different pills, these are different problems.
Right.
And yet if they start to institute just the simplest, albeit not easy, but the simplest lifestyle changes to start correcting the glucose, correcting the insulin, they'll find, much to their delight, that those medications can just stay in the medicine cabinet.
Right.
So what he's talking about there is that medication does not work to get rid of the root of the issue. It's really just masking the problems. And I totally agree. And this is where, everything that they're talking about in this video, I think it is valuable. Again, I'm just trying to provide nuance so that people aren't so afraid of carbohydrates. I think the ketogenic diet is really useful for getting people off of medications due to whatever chronic complication they've run into.
And then we tied that to diet. That's high carb, high sugar diets cause insulin resistance. Well, then what does that cause? Well, causes insulin resistance, causes obesity, which also causes insulin resistance. And then insulin resistance has a cascade of effects. One of them, erectile dysfunction is one of them. Alzheimer's
high
is
blood
one of
pressure.
them. Cancer is one of them.
Yeah.
High blood pressure, heart disease.
Yes.
Right. These are very bad things.
Oh yeah, the biggest of the bad.
Right. So we're really at the root of the cause of the so-called multiplicity
Exactly.
of negative consequences.
You remember how earlier in the conversation I was talking about obesity or being overweight is strongly correlated with all of these other chronic conditions. And he just said it right there, obesity. So it's not just carbs, it's carbs and fat because, again, 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. The easiest way to go into a caloric surplus is to add fat to your diet, not carbohydrates. Beyond candy, it's actually very hard to eat a lot of carbohydrates. I know because I eat a lot of carbohydrates. The only way it's easy to add carbohydrates is if they're in a vehicle combined with fat. So the donut sticks, for example, 1 donut stick is very small, but it's very energy dense. There's a lot of calories to it. There's a lot of sugar and there's a lot of fat with it. But for me, I eat a lot of long grain white rice. It's hard to cram a bunch of rice. Like if you talk to bodybuilders who are eating high carb diets, they get tired of eating. They have to eat a lot. Literally, it's like they're eating their chicken and their broccoli and their rice. They're eating a bunch of rice. It's hard to cram down a bunch of rice.
It's also the case that there's no recommended daily allowance for carbohydrates.
Yeah, oddly
Right?
enough.
So, I know, that's very odd. So expand on what that means.
So it's odd for multiple reasons, including I consider it the most pathogenic because of everything we've been describing, but it's also the one that is utterly unessential. You appreciate this, but most people don't. Even within the United States, the Department of Agriculture years ago had a statement where it says something like, I'm going to loosely quote it, the lower limit of dietary carbohydrates is 0.
Right. 0 is a low limit.
Okay.
Man.
Yeah, that's a pretty low number.
That's for sure.
And yet that's the one you tell me to eat the most of, born from the food guide pyramid in its ill-fated ideology.
So this is another point of agreement. No daily allowance for carbohydrates like there are for other foods. I think he's spot on here. I think there should be. Not only that, though, because again, I don't think it's just carbohydrates. I think it's the lack of activity. It's the lack of resistance training. It's the lack of doing cardio, running, all these high intensity things, long duration activities. I think there should also be sort of a warning saying, hey, excessive carbohydrate in the presence of being sedentary can lead to blah, blah, blah. I think that would also be a really beneficial thing to add. So my final stance is this. I think this video is great. I think these two have awesome chemistry. I'm really happy that Dr. Benjamin Bikman is in the Peterson Academy talking about this stuff. That's maybe a course that I might actually take. I think he's very interesting. He's very smart. And again, I am a fan of both of these people. The ketogenic diet and Alzheimer's and dementia. Ketogenic diet shows a lot of promise for fixing that issue because it's, as they say, it's type 3 diabetes or insulin resistance of the brain. So having a ketogenic diet can help give you an alternative fuel source so that your brain can actually process stuff like it used to when it was glucose dependent. However, just eating carbohydrates, this is where I disagree. Just eating carbohydrates won't lead to that. It's just a little bit of nuance that needs to be inserted there. As I mentioned, dietary fat can also be stored as fat because it's already in the form that it needs to be. It doesn't need to be converted. And so you run into a situation where you get perivascular fat and you essentially starve various tissues of the vital blood and nutrients that they need. And there are many other hypotheses around this issue. So again, it's trying to stop people from talking very matter-of-factly about it and just injecting some nuance. The ketogenic diet for obesity, sure, great tool, but it's totally not necessary. I think the main problem is that people don't know how to control their carbohydrate intake. So like you ask someone to eyeball a single serving of rice. Promise you they'll eyeball too much. Or ask someone to eyeball a single serving of cereal. They're going to eyeball too much. Like a single serving of cereal is not much. So I think the real issue here when people are talking about excessive carbohydrate, it's that people don't even know what a single serving is for most of this stuff. If you're having 1 to 2 cupped palms of carbohydrate, that's likely a single serving of rice. But if you're eating an entire plate of rice that's mixed with butter too, because that's what a lot of people do, they eat butter rice. It's not just rice. That's going to be a problem. Having a whole plate of pasta with just a little bit of chicken, it's not that the carbs are inherently bad. It's that you ate too much of it. Like if you're going to eat pasta, it should be a single section on the plate. It shouldn't take up the entire plate. Of course, you're going to feel terrible after eating an entire plate of pasta. And so if people don't really know how to eyeball proficiently, then this runs into the issue that the best diet is the diet you'll follow. And again, this goes back to my earlier point that for especially the carnivore diet, it's easy to just cut out an entire food group and just eat nothing but meat. It makes your grocery shopping easier. It makes your meal prep easier. And you just don't have to worry a lot of the times because it inherently puts you in a caloric deficit. So you'll end up losing weight along the way. But the last caveat I want to throw in here is that if you're doing the keto or carnivore diet, there is no room for error. You had better not be drinking alcohol and you had better not be having cheat days on the weekend because this is all one big experiment. This is all still really new. And the debate is still on whether cholesterol is an issue when it comes to cardiovascular disease. ApoB, which, people are trying to debunk LDL, but ApoB gets elevated as well in some of these diets. So you have to be careful because if you're increasing some of these blood markers and you're drinking alcohol, which is going to cause inflammation in the body, or you're having some massive cheat day on the weekend where you eat pizza or something, or just introduce carbohydrates back into your diet where you have some of these blood markers elevated, that's going to be a problem. So in a lot of ways, it's easier to just cut out an entire food group, but you can also run into problems if you're not super strict. There's no room for error. So if you're going to do it, just be careful. So the main point here is if you have some sort of pathology, sure, use an elimination style diet like a keto or carnivore diet to eliminate the food group, get your symptoms under control, slowly, systematically reintroduce some of those foods back in to see which one was the culprit in the first place, because it's probably not all of it. It's probably not all carbs. There's probably a few different foods that are really having an acute effect on your body that you just have no idea. And it might be food that you think is relatively healthy. For me, I have a hard time eating avocados. You would, I'm sure, say that avocados are a pretty healthy food, but not for everyone. Not everyone can handle it. Now I have ulcerative colitis, but yeah, the point still stands. But look, if you're on the keto or carnivore diet, I think you're doing great. I'm not here to tell you that you're doing something wrong. Okay. If whatever your reasoning is for doing it, great, keep doing it. I just want to inject the question, could you do what you're doing with fruits, veggies, and starches with proper planning and execution? And I think if you really think critically about that, you'll find that the answer is probably yes. But anyways, if you're still here, hit me with that subscribe button because obviously I've captured your attention enough that you're sticking around for the spicy information, or maybe it's just my monotone voice. I don't know, but either way, hit the like button so this hits the algorithm properly. I really appreciate you. But if you know someone that's on the keto or carnivore diet, send them this video. They might find it useful. They might learn a little bit, or they might just get pissed off at me and leave me a long tirade in the comments. But anyways, my name is Randall James. Once again, this is Always Adaptive Podcast. I appreciate you for being here with me. You can find this everywhere you get your podcast. So if you're ever on the go and you don't feel like watching on YouTube, you can find this on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, all that jazz. But I'm a strength and running coach. And what I really like to do is teach people that are already lifting weights how to introduce running into their strength training workouts, and also people that are already running how to strength train at home, because a lot of people that run, they don't want a gym membership. They're already outside running. And so, but they also recognize they need to start doing something. And so being able to train at your own house is actually an extremely useful thing. So if you're ever interested in coaching inquiries, you can hit me at randall@alwaysadaptive.com. And if you want to find me on social media, just type in Always Adaptive. I should pop right up. But once again, I appreciate you and I will see you at the next one.